In this second lecture on mergers and acquisitions, we shall examine the first question is, does the M&A context matter? Well, there are a number of nice examples. When Tata, the Indian conglomerate, acquired Jaguar Land Rover in 2008, they were ridiculed in the UK press for overpaying substantially for the company. A recession followed and Tata begged the UK government for financial support, and people saw that as being Tata really making a massive mistake for taking on this company, and the UK government wouldn't support them. However, several years later, Tata Jaguar was hailed as a massive M&A success. The question is, what changed? Now, some people would say that perhaps the Indians had a particularly distinctive way for managing post-acquisition integration, and we can certainly discuss that. However, let's not forget that both India and China emerged as economic superpowers at this time, and they had a huge penchant for Jaguar cars and Land Rover cars. Another example, when Morrisons, the supermarket in the UK, acquired Safeways, the enlarged group experienced serious decline afterwards, to the extent that investors pressed the then CEO, Tom Morrison, who was actually the founder of Morrisons Supermarket, to quit. The UK then went into a recession, and Morrisons actually started to do really well because they were offering cheap, cut-price food, and that's what consumers needed. Again, what changed? Another example is UK-based Cineworld's proposed acquisition of Canada-based competitor Cineplex for $1.6 billion was announced in December 2019 and was approved by shareholders in February 2020. I think we're all aware of COVID-19 causing chaos, and it caused the share prices of both companies to collapse, as the cinema business might actually completely dry up. We don't know if that deal will actually fall apart, but it sounds as if it could. So the important lesson here is mergers and acquisitions is never context-free, but the majority of M&A research ignores the context, and often so do managers, and we call that myopia. And in the reading list, there's an article in Long Range Planning by Audrey Rouzier, Helene Coleman and myself that actually talks about the importance of context and explaining M&A performance. One of the most pervasive features of mergers and acquisitions is that they come. From the previous slide, we identified that mergers and acquisitions come in waves. Now, Donald DePamphlis has a very good book on M&A, which is in your reading list, and he's identified certain waves over time, starting in 1897 with historical consolidation. Now, his waves are based on American data, mergers in the American market, so of course these dates will drift slightly depending on which parts of the world you're in. So that first wave that he actually identified, he described as being a Darwinian struggle between companies trying to turn themselves into industrial giants, and it all came to an end in a crash in 1904. The next wave was one of increasing concentration within industries, if you like the post-war boom after the First World War, and this ended also in a stock market crash in 1929. The next big wave was the conglomerate era in 1965 to 1969, and this is where the logic of companies buying companies in other regions or areas, so getting out of their current products and markets, what we would call diversification, in order to spread risk and hence form conglomerates. And the management framework most responsible for that was the Boston box, which I'm sure you know of, with its famous stars and dogs and cows and so forth. Anyway, unfortunately, around the 1980s, it became clear that conglomerates in fact underperformed the stock markets as a rule, because stock markets are relatively efficient, and as a consequence they started to achieve or attract discounts. So conglomerate share prices started to be traded at less value than the value of the individual companies within them. Now, I have to say, at the end of the period, I was involved in a very large takeover for British American Tobacco for $15 billion, and my job was to actually value all of the constituent companies. And by doing that, I came to a conclusion that all the pieces were worth far more than the whole. Therefore, it was a good idea to try and take the company over and break it up and sell off the various bits and pieces. The dumping decade, 1981 to 89, was also a time of slowing economies, and also leveraged finance, particularly junk bond finance, decided or became a problem, and so it became much, much harder for small companies to buy large ones. The era of 1992 to 2000 was described as one of mega mergers, and this is where there was an awful lot of deregulation around the world, so countries allowing inward M&A type activity. China would be a good example, and the rise of cross-border deals. There was a substantial reduction in trade barriers, there was a global trend of privatisation, and also an IT revolution which made coordinating complex multi-geographic businesses much easier. 2003 to 2008, it was a period of synchronizing world economies, and this coincides again with the stock market boom. And here we had horizontal mega mergers creating giants. So for instance, Mittal, which is an Indian steel company, took over Arcelor, a French steel company. Tata, the Indian conglomerate, took over Chorus, a UK steel company, and Santander, the Spanish bank, took over Abbey National, which is a UK building society. So this was huge concentration in single industries. That came to an end in 2008, and the next wave was focused upon rapid restructuring and buying bargains. Now, of course, there's been a wave since then, and as always, when we're in a wave, it's harder to characterise what the wave is about. But there's no doubt the beginning of the wave has been around capturing IT, particularly getting into digital, so large amounts of digital type acquisitions, although now maybe the urge to acquire digital is declining and companies are now acquiring to get market share. So how do we explain M&A waves? Well, this is actually harder than you might think. The common idea is that they correlate with stock market performance, but actually this is rather too simplistic for a whole variety of reasons, not least because of lags in performance, but also, of course, because markets move at different speeds around the world, and cross-border deals obviously have a distorting effect. Each wave seems to have a different characteristic, as I outlined in the previous slide, and that also makes prediction rather difficult. So, for instance, 2007 was about low cost of borrowing and booming stock markets and the rise of China and India as world powers. In 2015, it was about slow economic growth rates rather than fast ones, low inflation, weak wage growth, overcapacity and lack of pricing power. Here, companies are acquiring for consolidation. 2017, as I hinted already, was a massive drive to acquire tech companies, particularly trying to get into the Internet of Things and digital. And now 2019, it's about expanding customer bases. So one of the problems with identifying waves is that they don't follow consistent patterns, and in those terms they're actually quite tricky to predict. However, in broad terms, there is a theory that seems to hold or have a lot of merit in terms of trying to understand M&A activity. And this theory is about environmental shocks driving M&A activity. And these might be things like economic recovery or industrial and technological shocks, such as the internet boom, deregulation, perhaps with China open up its borders, or in the UK, deregulation of utilities like gas and water and electricity, and also shocks such as Brexit, which would be a macro political shock, and of course what we're living through at the moment, COVID-19. And it has to be said that the virus is obviously having a hugely destructive effect on economies, which may mean that with falling stock markets, European companies are going to actually have low valuations and will in fact be very cheap for other parts of the world where perhaps they're more cash rich, or perhaps they're economies that have recovered much faster. Indeed, I think there's talk at the moment about how to protect European companies from what might be a fast China recovery. However, you still have to have finance to engage in M&A. So even if the conditions are good, where's the money coming from? Where's the liquidity? And it also means that low-cost finance in itself may drive booms. So more recently, as central banks have been reducing interest rates, this is giving companies the liquidity to engage in M&A. The other point that's worth mentioning is contagion, and that is when you get M&A in certain industries, this may then have a knock-on effect to other connected industries, and the same also with countries. So whilst the USA tends to be a leader in sparking M&A activity, it then tends to have a knock-on effect to other areas, say the UK and Europe. And some of the work I've done, some of the research I've done in the past in the supermarket industry shows quite a close link between M&A in the USA followed by M&A in the UK and ultimately filtering and going through the whole of Europe. As I showed in the earlier chart about booms and busts, M&A is not all about the positive side of the picture, but also there are crashes. And in M&A, things go down very, very fast indeed. So if we look at the first quarter 2009, M&A activity fell 45% year on year. The effect on the advisory industry, particularly investment banks and private equity, was catastrophic. So investment banking advisory revenue was down nearly 60% in a quarter. Private equity deals were down 86% in a similar period of time. It also shows you that if you should choose to get into the investment banking world, not only can your career accelerate fast, but also you could possibly, if your timing is bad, be one of those people leaving the building with a cardboard box and a few meagre possessions. Why was it a crash in 2009? Well, because raising funds was a problem. Potential acquirer share price collapse. So in other words, acquirers didn't have enough equity value to make acquisitions, and of course overall uncertainty around the macroeconomic outlook. So in this case, how long would the credit crunch last? And I'm sure people at the moment are thinking exactly the same about the COVID virus. Now I include here a quotation from Paul Parker, head of global M&A at Barclays Capital, that was in 2009, because it brings out a rather interesting point. So just to read his statement: last year's broken deals would lead board members to be more cautious. As a board member, I want to be paying attention to certainty of value and particularly certainty of closing, which went by the wayside for a while. What he's basically saying is that during a boom period, there's so little time because of the boom to actually carry out due diligence and to really research a deal properly, that board members will be signing up to deals very, very rapidly, probably without actually doing anywhere near enough due diligence and checking the detail. What you get in a crash is the complete reverse, where suddenly it's very, very hard to do deals and people focus with microscopic attention on all the details, particularly around the certainty of value and certainty of closing. So as I say, very hard to get M&A deals done, but arguably probably better deals for the better and higher level of inspection. Also during a crash, this is a great time to buy. So when you look at those cycles of peaks and booms, and crashes, it's better to actually buy in a crash because share prices are closer to asset value. And if you do have cash to spare, this is the time perhaps to jump in, as I'm sort of hinting also for the COVID-19 period. Of course, very smart companies, and I have some indication this is happening now, are saying, well, maybe I could offload some assets even at a knockdown price in order to do the really smart strategic M&A deal. So your smarter acquirer is already thinking, how do I benefit even if cash is hard to come by through restructuring? So having talked in broad terms about booms and crashes, I now want to start looking at some frameworks that look at different areas or levels, if you like, of the context. So first of all, let's look at the macro environment. Now, I came up with a framework called the Stempel Framework, and if you want to read up about it, it's in a book called The Strategy Pathfinder, published in 2017, the third edition, page 46. And that gives you some headers to think about macroeconomic drivers of change which could influence M&A. I'll go through these very briefly. So first of all, the E in Stempel stands for economic change, macroeconomics, and this could be changes in tax regimes, exchange rates, cost of production, availability of finance, and indeed stock markets. How those change could give rise to opportunities for acquisition or possibly even the reverse, pressures for disposals. Social, which is the S of Estemple, is really around the tastes of the consumer and demographics such as age profiles. And here there may be also opportunities. If you've got a growing market, maybe you might want to acquire to get in to tap into that customer base. In terms of globalization of tastes, you may decide to make acquisitions to build the global firm so you can offer standardized products. T stands for technology, and I'm sure you're all fully aware of the importance of digital disruption. And I recently wrote a paper in the British Journal of Management, which came out this year, 2020, looking at how digital disruption can influence things like strategic alliances. It also has a very important effect on research and development costs. You only have to look at the car industry to see the massive change brought on by going electric, and also maybe engaging with hydrogen fuel cells and so forth. Technological diffusion is definitely a driver of M&A activity in a variety of ways. Ecological pressures, the attention to carbon emissions, pollution controls, global warming. You can make acquisitions to help you offset some of these. In terms of media influences M&A opinion. So it's clear that at certain times M&A is in vogue. Everyone finds it an exciting topic. There's a bandwagon effect as everyone wants to be involved. CEOs want to be seen doing M&A. And equally, it can go the other way. The media sees it as perhaps irresponsible, or other things ought to be taking precedence. And then finally, political and legal issues. Obviously, the consolidation of the EU in 1992 into a single market, and of course now Brexit, have hugely changed the political and economic landscape, giving rise to significant M&A opportunities. And of course, there are other boundary changes around the world. Similarly, governments' privatisations and deregulation restrictions can actually liberalise industries that previously were not open to acquisition or of this type. The final E in the framework is around ethics, and it's pretty hard to think probably of M&A specifically to do with ethics, although there's some very famous, maybe you can think of it, in Germany, where Monsanto was acquired, and that seems to be causing massive problems, you could argue, on an ethics perspective. At the industry level, there are a number of drivers as well. So if you remember Porter's five forces, which we'll come to in a few moments, it could be that that M&A can lower industry barriers. So if an industry is highly profitable, you may find companies from outside trying to get into the industry in order to extract some of that profitability. It may be a way of getting into new markets. So for instance, there may be territories where you don't have much expertise, but by buying a company that's already there and operating, you buy into their know-how about how to engage with those customers and perhaps how to engage with those institutions. In terms of life cycle, it seems that it's better to try and acquire during the maturity phase when you start getting an increase in industry pressure. So in other words, the market is perhaps not growing very much, it may even be flat. So how do companies get growth? Well, probably the best way is to acquire your direct competitors. This actual incentive increases as the industry life cycle goes into decline, because now the entire industry is experiencing negative growth, and therefore even to survive you need perhaps to acquire or exit. So when we talk about acquiring in this way, we call it consolidation. It's where a large number of players in the industry start combining through M&A. And you can see it in many of our large industries today, such as steel, automobiles, banking, pharmaceuticals, and so on. Now, of course, industry structure can change through deregulation, and this may break up monopolies. So in the UK, for instance, all the utilities, such as gas and telephone, used to be run by monopoly providers like British Telecom or British Gas. Through deregulation, companies could come into those industries and actually acquire certain businesses in order to improve competitive dynamics. And that certainly underlies a lot of the British government's thinking around M&A. By bringing in foreign entrants, that also may increase competition within an industry. So, for instance, again in the UK, in the supermarket industry, American acquirers coming in to buy British companies have actually intensified competition. So Walmart, for instance, coming in and buying Asda caused a reaction from the incumbents as they felt the competitive pressures increasing. In fact, you can also have new entrants into any industry where those companies might in fact be conglomerates like GE, who simply invest in an industry because they see it as being of high profit potential. So they're looking at the industry structure, and where there's a lot of profitability and reasonably high barriers to entry, then they might try to get into that industry in order to extract some profit for themselves. Of course, individual firms themselves may also change the rules of the game, and there's no doubt that Amazon and to some extent Google are doing this at the current time by buying companies in various industries and affecting the dynamics. Also within industries, the actual speed at which M&A is conducted can change at different rates for different industries and at different times. However, an interesting paper by Mitchell and Mullerin found that you get a bit of a clustering of response. So you may have a period of very little M&A in an industry, and then a particular company will set everyone off to doing M&A, rather like a copycat effect as the competitive dynamics change. And they found a tremendous concentration, that you get about 50% of M&A in the industry within 2 years. And that's what the figures on the right-hand side relate to. And these are actually taken from the textbook in the chapter by Matthew Checkley on risk. And essentially what this is showing is a number of accounting companies in the UK in 1996 showing a wide distribution of fees from 1.3 billion per year for Grant Thornton to 9.5 billion per year for Arthur Andersen. He's then expressed these as a table beneath, and what you can see is a big change in tiers. So for instance, if you look at the Big Eight in 1988, they had 1.6 billion in average revenue, and the next tier had 288 million in revenue. However, by 2002, there'd been a lot of consolidation, and I'm sure you know some of the names. So Price Waterhouse, for instance, merged with Coopers & Lybrand, and that became the number one firm. So there was a big concentration then into the Big Four, and so in 2002, the Big Four had 4.4 billion in revenue, some 4 times that of the Big Eight in 1988, but the next tier had actually stayed almost the same at 290 million. In other words, a lot of the rewards accrue to the biggest players, and the tier in the middle gets squeezed and becomes victimised. There is something of an earthquake analogy to this. So, for instance, the accounting industry had been relatively stable, but once those mergers had kicked off, and I have to say in this case they were mergers, you then get other firms anticipating and reacting in order to adjust to the new situation. And there is certainly an industrial mindset that basically says you need to be in the top 3 or 4, probably the top 3, to have long-term survivability. Waves with peaks and troughs. So here we have Porter's 5 forces, and I think it's quite useful as a way of showing M&A in the context of industry structure. So if a company in the rivalry box acquires a direct rival, we call this a consolidation M&A or a horizontal M&A. And the main purpose behind this is to achieve scale efficiencies. So it means that you can get rid of duplication between the two companies. You can consolidate manufacturing facilities, for instance. You can rationalize supply chains. And of course, you can get increased bargaining power over customers. And examples might be Morrison's taking over Safeways, both UK supermarkets, and you will have seen in your case, or say BMW taking over Rover. Going to the right of the diagram, we have buyer power. So if a company in the rivalry box acquires a buyer, what they're essentially doing is locking in certain customers. And there's a good reason for this. One is to attempt to achieve reduced transaction costs. In other words, if you have a powerful buyer, they may be forcing you to reduce the price of your output, if you're in the rivalry box, because of their strength. However, if you acquire them, you see some of the profitability that the buyer is actually achieving through their position. So we call this a vertical forward integration. It reduces transaction costs, and it allows you also to secure a customer. And that will allow you also to get better market intelligence. An example would be American Online merging or taking over, as it was, Time Warner. Going to the other end of the supply chain, a company in the rivalry box might take over a supplier. We call this vertical backward integration. And again, this might reduce transaction costs, and it secures supply. So an old example, but an interesting one, was that Chorus, the UK steel company, tried to take over CSN of Brazil. Now, this is actually an iron ore company, and iron ore is a critical supply for steel. Unfortunately for Chorus, they weren't able to negotiate the deal properly, and it failed, thus making Chorus vulnerable to takeover, and it was taken over by Tata, the Indian conglomerate. So there's an interesting question, which is, we can see the advantage of taking over a supplier or a buyer. We can reduce our transaction costs. But does this mean you should always try to take over a supplier or a buyer? Well, I think we ought to take it that not all suppliers and buyers have the same value. So if we look again at, say, the suppliers, just thinking about suppliers, if there's a very powerful supplier with some form of monopolistic control, then if you could take them over, that would give you a great deal of power. And also, it would probably give you some power over your competitors as well. However, if there are a large number of suppliers out there, simply buying one supplier doesn't really necessarily affect the competitive dynamics in your industry. Also, maybe it's tying up your resources if that supplier only accounts for a very small amount of input to your company. So how do you decide? Well, you decide in terms of whether or not the supplier is supplying you with a critical resource or capability. If it's not critical, then probably it's not worth the cost of the transaction. Looking upwards, we see a red line across the diagram. These are barriers to entry, and as I suggested in the previous slide, M&A is a good way to overcome barriers to entry. There can be lots of these. Things like technological requirements. There could be cultural differences if you're going cross-border. It could be investment requirements. It may cost an awful lot of money to invest in this particular industry. So M&A may allow you to get into the industry by not having to try to overcome those requirements, which you would do with organic growth, for instance. And then finally, and the slightly obscure type, you can find, if you look at the bottom left, you can sometimes find that in fact it's not the acquirer that's driving the deal, but maybe a powerful buyer or supplier putting pressure on a company in the industry box, in the rivalry box. So for instance, Nokia was quite famous in Finland for putting some pressure on suppliers to amalgamate or take over other companies in order to help provide capabilities and products into the Nokia supply chain. So this is an indirect form of pressure upon a company to make a merger that it might not do otherwise. And just to remind you how this links to the previous slide on macro-environmental drivers, around the edge of our five forces, of course, we still have those extempore factors. They do make a difference. So in conceptual terms, we've looked at a couple of layers in the context. We've looked at the macro layer and we've looked at the industry layer. And these are pressures upon industries that could affect firms. And this diagram here shows changes in the global environment, if you like, our macro factors, which we've talked about, and they'll offer up a whole series of opportunities, but also of risks. And the direction of travel of the line shows that these will change over time. Now, it's very difficult for firms to respond exactly and directly to what's happening in the external environment, and so they can only approximate at best, which is why you have this undulating curve underneath. And firms will try to anticipate or react to those pressures as they occur. So they basically are constantly making strategic responses to defend their businesses and also enhance their competitive positions in an ever-changing environment. And one of the best ways to do this is through mergers and acquisitions, because it allows you to react quickly to those changes or anticipated changes in the context. And that will allow firms to access strategic proprietary assets, gain market power and market dominance, achieve synergy gains, become larger, to diversify and spread risks, exploit financial opportunities, and, as we'll talk about later, perhaps there'll be some personal benefits for those involved as well. So far we've talked about external pressures upon firms to engage in M&A. But what is the impact of M&A? So if firms carry out these deals, what's the effect? Well, this happens on different levels. So for some companies it helps drive a globalization strategy. So in the past, for instance, Ford, the automotive company, went on a buying spree and bought many car companies around the world, including Aston Martin, Jaguar in the UK, Volvo in Sweden, Mazda in Japan, Land Rover in the UK, and many more. So through rapid expansion, they used M&A to build a global footprint. Another company that's done the same is HSBC Bank. They've made acquisitions in most countries in the world. They also have an impact at the national level, particularly cross-border, of course. So if a company in one country buys a company in another country, you may get a backlash depending on which country they've come from. So an example of Nestlé Rowntree, which you'll look at, was a Swiss company buying a very large chocolate manufacturer in the UK, a huge employer, and one that had a very long history. As a consequence, employees were angry and they went on various marches to London with placards saying, "Stop the Swiss from stealing our Smarties," and these are the sweets that Rowntree's made. And part of the annoyance was the fact that the UK market is open or relatively transparent to M&A, whereas the Swiss market is quite restrictive. So there was a feeling that we weren't on a level playing field. When BMW decided to take over Rover, there was also an outcry, and even questions were asked in the House of Commons, which in the UK is a typically understated form of protest. People thinking about maybe some previous conflicts. In terms of hostile mergers in Europe, you can imagine that if you get a large hostile takeover from a foreign acquirer, again you're going to get a negative reaction, mostly sponsored by fear, because hostile takeovers are normally followed by lots of restructuring and a lot of job loss. And I think businesses, of course, are embedded in national cultures, and what you might be doing is not just challenging a business model of a company through acquisition, but you also might be challenging the prevailing culture in a society about what the purpose of business is for, because it's not just about profit. And also there can be greater fear of monopoly power, that somehow these mega giants that stride the globe are actually not giving you much choice in particular countries. And you can see a certain amount of that at the moment with European regulators pushing back at the likes of Google and so forth. M&A can have a regional impact as well. So whilst there might be restructuring following an M&A, if we look at global companies, that may not fall equally across the entire organisation. So if you have any knowledge, for instance, of petrochemical and oil companies, some of those large mergers that have taken place over the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the rationalisation and restructuring has actually been in North African countries, and that's of course had some very negative effects there in terms of employment. So you can get localised mass redundancies rather than simple averaged spreading of redundancy across the globe. It can also affect you in terms of supply chain impacts. So if you think about M&A happening along supply chains, when you combine companies across two supply chains, the acquirer may almost certainly rationalise its supply chain. So companies further down the supply chain may not be aware, or I should say further up the supply chain, may not be aware the M&A is going to happen, but of course they could be very directly affected. So you need to watch your supply chains for M&A taking place. And also on a regional basis, some smaller economies are worried that you get a bit of a brain drain. So, for instance, German and American companies like buying in Scotland, and as a consequence, a lot of Scottish companies get taken over, meaning there are fewer and fewer top-profile jobs for Scottish students to go to. So this has an implication for university students. Where are they going to get their jobs? A further aspect of M&A impact is that the very big deals can actually restructure industries. You've already seen the Time Warner and American Online example, and this shows how industry boundaries can begin to dissolve as a consequence of M&A, which changes the competitive balance for all incumbent businesses. Another famous example, because it was on a very large scale, was Big Bang in the City of London, where a lot of financial providers were deregulated, and it gave the chance for universal banks to be formed, which broke down all the industry barriers between stockbrokers and commodity brokers and future traders, commercial banks, investment banks, and so forth. And of course, if you happen to be a relatively small provider, a middle market provider in some of these areas, you are quite badly disadvantaged. And then at the corporate level, you can have a huge impact, obviously from the employee point of view in particular. So it's a famous example, although it's an old one, it's often in people's minds. So when Hanson acquired Eveready Batteries in 1981, they reduced head office staff from 550 to 75. They cut management layers from 9 to 3, and they cut factory staff by 60% in a matter of months. So you can imagine how unpleasant that would have been. And in most people's minds, when you think you're about to be acquired, obviously there's the threat of redundancy. Your careers may be sacrificed. Your promotion prospects may go up in smoke. It's a very uncertain and worrying time. And for that reason, you can get a lot of rumours and hostility as a result of M&A taking place. So the final category then is the personal impact. Harvard Business Review reckons that 1 in 7 executives are directly affected. My guess is much higher these days, and it's something that people ought to be aware of. I think the takeaway from this slide, though, is that M&A is a multi-level, multi-dimensional process. So when a deal takes place, it's not just between company A and company B, but it has a wide effect on multiple levels and multiple stakeholders, and there can also be contagion effects. I would now like you to read the short case, Changing the Face of Industry. This was a famous battle for a supermarket in the UK called Safeways, and because of its strategic importance, all of the supermarkets in the UK decided to bid for Safeways, or at least declare they were bidding for Safeways, along with Kohlberg Kravis, which is a takeover raider, and Philip Green, who was a famous retail entrepreneur. I'd like you to read the case and have a think about what you believe the answers might be for the 5 questions that follow. And probably the best thing to do is to turn this recorded sound off, and in the next slide I'll provide you with some solutions. So the takeaways from this lecture are that M&A is important. It's been around for a very long time, and I think it'll be around for a long time to come. It's important in economic, social, technological and political terms, and it's designed to create benefits, synergies, which is the key word, and these can be in different forms. The lectures that stress the importance of macro forces in determining M&A occurrence and outcomes, and by macro it can be at the global level, the institutional level, and also we might include industry level as well. They're just one important layer in the M&A puzzle, and then in the next lecture we shall be looking at firm level strategy to try and understand what is it that makes or why a particular firm might decide to take over another firm. I think the main message, of course, is that M&A is a multidimensional phenomenon and it's interdisciplinary in nature, and it's necessary to think about it in those terms if you really want to understand any particular M&A deal. Approximately 20-year time span, 2000 to 2019, And you can quickly see that there was a mini boom in 2000, a big boom in 2007, and another one in 2015, accounting for about 4.7 trillion US dollars of deals. And there are also troughs, most notably 2002 and 2009, which was the financial crisis. The first thing to take away, of course, is that even in the most severe crises, M&A does not stop, because lots of deals need to take place. Another thing worth noting is that the thick blue line running at the bottom of the chart actually shows you the mega deals. These are deals of more than 5 billion that take place. And you can see that they're having a very big distorting effect on the overall level of M&A that's taking place. So in fact, it's the mega deals that are responsible for the very large troughs and very large peaks, not just deals in general. In terms of what are the mega deals, well, 2009, on the right-hand side, we have United Technologies taking over Raytheon for 121 billion, Bristol Myers Squibb taking on Selenia for 74 billion, and Group PSA taking on Fiat Chrysler for 50 billion. And 2018, T-Mobile taking on Sprint, 120 billion, Walt Disney taking on 21st Century Fox for 75 billion, and Takeda Pharma taking over Shire for 64 billion. And not only are these giant deals, but often many are cross-border as well, although many seem to be within sector as opposed to across sector. Another feature of these waves is that around about 25% for a long time were cross-border deals, although more recently global totals have been increased for cross-border deals, now running at about 40%. And of course, one of the largest cross-border acquirers is China, and as it says here, in 2016 they accounted for $250 billion of deals, so very large, although since 2017 the government has increased restrictions on what they see as irrational deals, and that's caused a significant downturn in Chinese volume by 41% in 2017. So here we have institutional factors influencing the global picture as well. It's also worth noting that China tends to be relatively counter-cyclical in when it buys its companies, so tending to buy more in a downturn rather than in an upturn. Context. And in fact, to be accurate, it should be contexts, because there are multiple contexts that affect M&A.